So I'm going to briefly share some of these points. Lori did such a magnificent job of really going over some of the nitty-gritty details. So I'm Petra, first and foremost, and I hail from Western New York in the Finger Lakes. So we have a slightly more challenging environment for growing biennials, and we're undaunted, except we are daunted by a few crops, it's very true. We're in the Finger Lakes in Zone 5, and we focus on organics and also regional adaptation. But as I'll share, especially with this Dulcinea carrot, I've eaten some humble pie / humble carrot cake over the years, so I'm really honored to share so much of what I've learned, knowing this is just the beginning. Well, really, so far from the beginning, but so far from the end of this conversation. And I'm so glad to be here with you all. So Fruition Seeds, I wanted to just back up and say too, I am so grateful for so many of people in this room, looking at you, Lori, looking at you, John, so many people who have taught me so much about, is Don Tipping here? About biennials over the years, and OSA, so many publications that you have available online that have been part of our journey. And in 2012, Matthew and I started Fruition, and now there's 7 of us, without whom I wouldn't be here smiling. So thank you to all of the ancestors and all of you in this room and everyone, so that we can all eat and learn and grow together. So I too wanted to talk about cabbage, and Lori, you did such a wonderful job. And I just to add upon what Lori shared, one of the things that you mentioned and how we approach it too, we don't want to grow 2 acres of cabbage just to be roguing 85% of them. So we collaborate with lots of organic growers within our bioregion, ideally as close as possible. This farm is about 50 miles from our main farm, which is about as far as is realistic for us. But they were growing 2,000 heads of this cabbage, and this is Calibos, an heirloom cabbage that this Blue Heron farm had watched personally erode over a few decades, and they continued to grow it. Well, let me not give you all the backstory, but it was amazing to be able to collaborate with a market grower, and they would only have to, we would go in with tons of flags, and then at first, and so this is also a huge, I just love Beth so much, and I'm so, growing cabbage has totally transformed for us as a direct result of Beth and Meadowlark Hearth. So we initially were keeping the heads on because we didn't know any better, and putting them in great big totes with slightly moist but mostly dry peat moss, putting it in our cold storage because I was just skiing, and I have been since mid-November. And with any luck, I'll still, I've hunted Easter eggs in plenty of snowstorms. So we have a serious winter. So that biennial storage is quite a thing. So we bring them vernalization period, no problem. I mean, in terms of having a minimum vernalization period. So bringing it in and storing it is totally a thing. And so initially we had them with the heads on, and then we would, just make lots of kraut in the spring, take off of course, the disgusting, rotting outer leaves, and then make kraut from the rest. And I loved all the apical buds, all of the buds emerging, axillary buds on the sides. And Matthew, he's so handsome. And look, we now take all of the heads off, and I love it so much. Beth, our dear friend Dandy, spent some time with you and learned so much. And so it's wonderful because now this farmer who so generously was giving us the cream of his crop can now market 100% of their crop. And so we just put lots of flags with lots of different colors in the ground so that we know which ones we're digging up. And then we dig them up, and they store so much better, and they produce just as much seed. So Beth, thank you so much for sharing everything that you have. We grow Lots of onions and leeks as well. And certainly in the Northeast, we have to do this in a greenhouse, or pardon me, in a high tunnel. And I just love this as well, that long season makes such a phenomenal selection for long storing varieties. And I can't wait to hear how Beth is going to respond to your question about spring cabbages. And certainly other kinds of onions are a challenge for us, but those long storing onions, and then we just make tons of pickled onions here in about 3 weeks. I can't wait. But planting leeks out after overwintering them, again, in our cold storage. And yeah, you can see they're so beautiful, full of seed, but it wouldn't be possible for us in our very humid, rain pummeling down summers, even when the rain isn't pummeling down. It's just, we have such a humid climate. So very grateful for the technology available to us. But this radish I wanted to lift up as well, because another example, and those leeks and onions, the same story. To actually have robust populations that we can make really great selections on, we collaborate with local growers so that we can be choosing, like from those onions, we'll be picking out the best 500 onions from 5,000 onions. With these radishes, with other crops, it's sometimes upwards of 50,000 in a population. And so it's really extraordinary selections that we would never be able to make on our little farm with, limited resources. And it's lovely because the farmers barely even notice that 500 radishes walked off. And this particularly is a collaboration. We've been playing with Stone Barns and Jack Algiers, and this is Jason. And so they've been selecting them and sending them overnight to us in the mail. It's better than Christmas morning when we get that overnight box of radishes with the greens and soil still on. And we, they're weak biennials, so as in WEAK. So we just throw them in the fridge in our cooler for 3 weeks. And then I don't have any great pictures, but we've learned over the years, we initially just brought them out into the field and planted them, and we would lose between 20 and sometimes 50% to, I forget what it is, but it's this little root maggot, this little fly that their larva would be like, oh, thank you, it is spring, and now you have these lovely radishes for us. But we've completely eliminated them munching our roots by putting them in totes, just like tulip trays in our greenhouse, in 6 inches of soil, starting them there. So they're already beginning to sprout, but barely. They've begun to regrow. And at that point, their sensitivity, their susceptibility to that pest apparently passes. So we've been doing that for a few years now, and it's been amazing. So we do that with a lot of our other biennial crops as well. So transplanting, bringing them out of vernalization, growing them in tightly grown in little tulip trays, and then transplanting to the field once they've really gotten a hold and are emerging with their foliage. So then, I just like to eat radish pods as well, and it's so hard to not eat them. And winnowing them, perhaps if we have questions about seed cleaning, that can also be such a thing. I love this photo because I love reminding myself that, yes, I'm an organic farmer. What is going on? Yes, we're organic farming. And finally, I'd love to share just a little story about carrots as well. And Lori did such a wonderful job of really laying out how the dynamics, the mechanics of biennial carrot production. This is a new variety that we collaborated with Aussie and University of Wisconsin-Madison, especially Claire Luby and Erwin Goldman. And they have, all of these open source seed initiative carrot populations from all the different market classes. And so we really, one of our key collaborators has been growing Bolero. How many of you grow Bolero? Or yeah. So Nathaniel grows 100 acres of biodynamic vegetables, and he's very reliant on Bolero and would love not to be. So one day he said, this is maybe 6 years ago, he said, Petra, I'd love for you to dehybridize Bolero. And I said, oh. Wouldn't you though? And because I don't know how to say anything differently, I said, okay, let's do it. And I promptly called Erwin, and 100th monkey syndrome. He and Claire had already crossed Bolero with their Aussie nonce, just market class population. So they already had the beginnings of this project, and they sent us 6 different lines. And this photograph is remarkable to me because I love this carrot, and that was the first generation of our favorite line that they had crossed, but it's also the first day that we had Poncho and Davi in our lives. So that's little 6-week-old Davi. But so from there, that was the only generation of seed that we actually grew on our farm from those 6 initial lines. We grew them on Nathaniel, who's in the middle there on his farm, and that's Erwin Goldman on the left. And so from there, and Erwin, these are just such extraordinary partners. I love how you spoke about partnerships, Lori. I also would not be here smiling without so many extraordinarily generous collaborators. And so Nathaniel would grow hundreds and then thousands and then tens of thousands of roots. We'd make selections, and Erwin he would vernalize and then grow them in his glass houses over the winter. So, not entirely, we're not turning this biennial into an annual by any means, but he was able to compress that biennial cycle into an annual cycle. And that's just in August. Actually, that's in late July. And so there's 4 acres of Dulcinea is the name of the variety that Nathaniel now has to grow. And I wanted to share a little bit too, just celebrating that glorious thing of tasting them. How many of you have tasted carrots, kind of populations of carrots in their breeding? Yes. How many of you have gotten the piney resinous flavors? Yes. And the bitter turpentine. And then I love being able to taste all of that diversity, and so that is one of my favorite parts, without question. And I wanted to lift up John Navazio too. I love dragon and so many of your varieties, John. And as much as with Dulcinea, we're really striving for a badass variety that can actually replace Bolero. Damn it! So there's a certain amount of uniformity that we're really striving for. But it's diversity. If we're not talking about diversity, we're asking the wrong question. And so I love other populations that really celebrate so viscerally, so vividly in our eyes, that diversity as well. So that's Dulcinea, yay. And if you'd like to try some seed, I would love to share some with you. Fruitionseeds.com is where you'll find seeds, but check us out too, because we have lots of seed saving information as well as just general growing information on our website. I do lots of little YouTube videos about growing, but on seed saving as well. And I'd love to, open up the floor and hear all of your questions, but really hear all of your observations and stories from across the seasons as well. One more time?
Overwinter your carrots.
Oh, how do we overwinter our carrots? Great question. So we overwinter our carrots by lifting them on the late side, so they're already starting to turn dormant, but well before, there's any cracking or any visible signs of, stress on the roots. And then because we work with Nathaniel and this, we would probably do it differently if we were doing this internally, but because we're working with our collaborators, it's part of his system is to be mechanically lifting them. So they're mechanically lifted, and then just put soil soil still on. They're put in great big bins. And then, so we do an initial selection, and then Nathaniel also just puts them soil on in bags that have little holes so they breathe. And then we bring those into our cooler, and they just have to hang out till, honestly, it was just a couple weeks ago that we did our tasting of them. And from there, we send them, oh, and this is another important part. I told you about humble pie / carrot cake. I started Fruition with like a lot of, I mean, I still have lots of tunnel vision, don't get me wrong. But I started Fruition with Matthew with this tunnel vision of kind of this for us, by us, rugged individualism that I didn't even recognize, where I was like, regional adaptation is so significant. Let's like do this in New York, y'all. And I think that doing the selections are really important in New York. But we're not growing the seed in New York. We're sending them to partners, collaborators on the West Coast who have ideal conditions for carrot growing. So we're making the agronomic selections in the field, sending those stecklings. They've already been sent to our partners on the West Coast who are able to then just kind of put them in the ground, honestly. So they've been perfectly vernalized in the context of New York between Nathaniel's farm and then our farm where we do the tastings along with Nathaniel. So then, yeah, does that answer your question?
The question all the way in the back.
Yeah, we have someone online who's wondering why you cut the onions in half for seed production in the greenhouse.
Oh, yeah, awesome. So we cut the onion like more than in half. We really want to be getting down to, like, we really just leave like an inch, not even, of the root plate. And that's because we really want to be selecting for having as few kind of centers as possible. Onions left to their marvelous genetic entropy will put up, they want to make seed, they want to reproduce just like the rest of us, well, with some exceptions. Maybe, but when people ask me if I have children, a small aside, I say yes, and great, great, great grandchildren. And if I think they have a sense of humor, I say, and you can eat them. So onions, too, really want to reproduce, just like the vast majority of us. And so they'll put up lots of those seed stalks. And what that translates to unchecked, it's such a weird way to say it, those centers will become more and more and more and more. So we want to be selecting for as few centers as possible. 3 is kind of the max that we let fly. And generally, they'll put up a few more, but at least in that primordial state, there's 3. So that means in the kitchen, too, they're that much easier to process. And then there's that much less resistance for them to be growing as well. And, I love because in our humid seasons as well, if we weren't growing these in the high tunnel, they would very easily rot, mold, just become collection saucers for humidity to then vector all kinds of disease. So I wouldn't recommend this technique in the Northeast or other humid climates where you're not, without a plastic covering over the top. Great question. Yeah.
Living in Montana and trying to respect the resource use of everything that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to figure out how to store carrots with hay bales and living in the mountains and snow and trying not to get the mice or rats into them. I didn't know if anybody knew more pioneer ways of storing carrots without having a root cellar and not trying to use dinosaur parts to cool everything.
A great question about how do we store carrots without all of these inputs. And I open the floor, John.
A lot of the old timers all over the country would dig pits, storage pits, just making sure you're below the frost layer in the soil. You know, if you have to go wherever you are, if you're in Montana, you might have to go 3 or 4 feet deep. But that's very classic. A lot of old books about vegetable gardening and storing all your root crops and cabbages and everything. They just dig a pit.
And then what they do how would they insulate it? without
Well,
freezing?
you know, I don't, you really should read up on it, because I've never done it, so I can say, but, you know, I think they often throw in some straw or something on top of it, so you have kind of a layer between just throwing the soil back in, right? But you really have to know how deep your frost line is in your soil, basically. But it's very successful. People have done it all over the world for a long time.
I'll take it.
Yeah.
I'll repeat for our listeners for the recording. That was magnificent. So an alternative to using lots of infrastructure and inputs to vernalizing winter roots, there will be a point where the soil doesn't freeze. So knowing, experimenting where that point is in your soil, and then committing to getting a shovel or something so that you can dig down, store those roots beneath the frost line, and then somehow protecting them from the rodents who could potentially come in as well. But great question. I'm so glad that we're thinking about how do we do this without the amenities of the 21st century.
I think we have time for one more question, and I saw somebody's hand up in the back. Do you want to ask your
No, I
question?
was just going to comment. I live in Montana, and I've had success actually with, if you've got, I don't know if it's climate change or whatever, but if you've got a good snow cover, and I just put a large quantity of straw on top. You get some loss, but I've been able to successfully overwinter the crops already just in the soil.
Okay, so this is someone who also lives in a cold winter climate and overwinters the crops just under the snow with a quantity of straw on top as insulation, and that's yeah, right. Is there, did you say on top of the snow? You put the straw on top of the snow? All right, right on. Okay. that makes more sense than what we both heard over here. Okay, so straw, snow on top, insulation. Okay, John, and then we're going to move on.
Having done that, sometimes it works out swell, you know, if you get especially enough snow cover. It's amazing how in cold winter places like Maine, where I live, or used to do it in Montana as well, way back. But sometimes you're setting up the rodent hotel.
Yes, exactly.
You know, they love it under there. And so sometimes people use some sort of mesh screening or something on top. You know, just think about how do I protect it from rodents and
Hardware cloth.
right?
I was thinking about gravel.
It's hard to.
Yeah, so there's one more suggestion that sometimes rodents can get in when you're just doing the mulch and then snow layers, and that if you could use a mesh screen or find some other way to keep the rodents out, that would be useful. And I know there were other questions, but we're going to have a little more time at the end. I just want to make sure we turn it over to Beth. But thank you, Petra.